Hello and welcome to Storytime with Mr. Laws. Today we're reading Fintan Fedora, the World's Worst Explorer by Clive Goddard. Chapter 25. The mood in Fintan's little expedition was low. They had made virtually no progress during the miserable rain-soaked day, and a feeling of hopeless dejection had crept over them. All hope of being the first to reach the chocoplums had gone. They had lost. Worse still, they had lost because Fintan hadn't managed to keep his mouth shut and had blurted out the secret to a complete stranger. He trudged wearily through the mud, imagining what Corentina would say if she knew what was about to happen to her beloved secret grove, and even more scarily what Anna would do to him if she found out. Evening fell, and there was still no let-up in the torrential rain. They stopped and made camp again. There was no dry wood anywhere, so all hopes of putting the kettle on for a nice cup of tea and having something warm to eat had to be forgotten again. Fintan sheltered with Gribbly under a waterproof tarpaulin, listening to the relentless tropical downpour. He sighed. All conversation had fizzled out hours before and had been replaced by a sort of mutual, dull, grey resignation. An hour or so later, they had set up their hammocks, covered them in the plastic sheet, and eaten a few boring dried rations. Fintan was just hauling the iron cooking pot up a tree when he realised the rain was finally stopping. "About time, too," he said. It was only when the rain's constant hammering noise had completely faded that they became aware of other, much less natural sounds. Not very far away, something was making a sort of deep, vibrating roar, like a nasty mechanical cough. There were creaking and sweeping noises and thundering crashes. They stared at each other for a moment before understanding what it was. "Chainsaws," said Fintan, raising his eyebrows in horror. "They're cutting down the chocoplum trees." Hurriedly, they grabbed their head torches and fumbled through the dark undergrowth towards the terrible sound. It appeared to be very close by, just the other side of a high ridge of ground. Gribbly, anxious that they shouldn't get lost, had tied a bit of string to the end of his hammock and was gradually feeding it out as they went. An unnaturally brilliant light illuminated the horizon and shone eerily through the trees. They scrambled up to the top of the muddy bank and gazed down the other side at a horrible, stomach-turning sight. What had once been Corentina's beautiful secret valley now looked like a war zone. In the glare of several powerful arc lamps erected around the site's perimeter, Giganti Foods International's huge mechanical diggers were busy destroying the grove, while 3 massive black cargo helicopters sat like hungry crows, waiting to carry the uprooted trees back to their nests. What had, until very recently, been untouched rainforest was now a mess of men, mud, and logging equipment. The air around them throbbed with the noise of generators and was filled with the smell of petrol fumes, wet wood, and disturbed earth. At least a dozen men, wearing bright red Giganti Foods boiler suits, were packing the felled trees into sheets of plastic and loading them into metal containers. Others were putting the finishing touches to a temporary corrugated iron hut, and several more were hacking at the remaining tree roots with a variety of heavy machinery. Standing proudly, right in the middle of the carnage, was Max Wrench himself, pointing and shouting orders and apparently enjoying himself enormously. Fintan and Gribbly's jaws dropped in shared horror. This was terrible. It was all over. For some time they crouched on the brow of the hill and watched in stunned silence, with no idea what to say or do. Fintan fought back a tear. If Corentina and Anna could see this, they would be heartbroken, and would probably want to kill him too. Eventually, the bulldozer's engines were turned off, and the men gradually stopped work for the night. Wrench congratulated his team on a fine day's work and disappeared with them into the small hut for an excellent evening meal and a lot of showing off. Only a pair of security guards remained active, patrolling the edge of the site, and occasionally pointing their guns into the surrounding forest. "I'm going down there, Gribbs," said Fintan resolutely. "I've got to try and find a choco-plum before they take the lot." Gribbly was understandably not keen on the idea. "You do realise, sir, that there are men with guns down there, and that they have been instructed to shoot you on sight." "Yeah, I know," said Fintan, but it's what we came all this way for, isn't it? I'm not letting that greedy lot take them all. That's just plain selfish." After a short pause and some careful thought, Gribbly found himself agreeing. They had indeed come a long way and put up with all manner of hardships to get this close to their prize. It was an incredibly dangerous thing to attempt, especially for someone as accident-prone as Fintan, but to turn around and leave now would be unforgivable. "Very well, sir," he said, "but I insist on coming with you." The slope down into the grove wasn't too steep, but was extremely muddy and dotted with little prickly bushes, which gave them a little bit of cover and a lot of prickles. Cautiously, they slithered down through the soggy earth and leaf litter until they reached the last of the bushes and peered out into the grove, or what was left of it. The bright lights erected around the perimeter meant they had a perfectly clear view of its mangled, ripped-up remains. From close up it looked even worse. Every single one of the trees had completely gone. In only a few hours, Wrench's team of highly trained thugs had taken the whole lot and left nothing but a few scattered branches, muddy leaves and twisted roots. The two security guards were now chatting together and walking casually around the devastation, looking very pleased with themselves. Judging by the way they were swaggering about, Fintan guessed they weren't actually expecting anyone to sneak past them. They were, after all, hidden in a secret valley, deep in the middle of the world's biggest rainforest, protecting a few trees which hardly anyone believed in. And they had big guns, all of which meant they weren't paying much attention to their jobs. This, of course, was good news for Fintan, who wasn't known for his stealth. When the guards strolled to the other side of the site, Fintan and Gribbly, who had tied his length of string to the prickly bush, made their move. Together they crept into the glare of the lights, across the bare ground, and hid behind a large tank of fuel. From this vantage point, they had an even better view of the whole ugly scene. None of the trees were accessible. Every single one had been wrapped and loaded for transit. Their only chance of finding any fruit was to scour the mess littering the ground. Even that didn't look very promising. "Look," hissed Gribbly eventually, pointing towards one of the park diggers. "Over there, beneath that vehicle. I think those branches still have some fruit on." Fintan looked, and for the first time in his life laid eyes on the great Brazilian choco-plum. It was real. A bit battered, perhaps, and lying in the mud churned up by the digger's caterpillar tracks, but definitely real. Reddish-brown and shiny, like a big soft conker, just like the magazine had described it. "Brilliant," he whispered, and a big relieved grin appeared on his face. They may have been beaten by the might and wealth of Giganti Foods International, but if he could just get one choco-plum safely home and plant the seed, then all was not lost. Crawling on their hands and knees, Fintan and Gribbly made their way through the mud from one hiding place to another until they reached the bent and broken branch under the huge mechanical digger. There was at least one undamaged fruit still dangling from it, and a handful of sad-looking specimens lying around, trampled underfoot. Carefully, and with a rush of great excitement, Fintan picked the choco-plum and held it reverently in the palm of his hand. It was surprisingly heavy for its size and shone beautifully in the glaring security lights. It had the soft, fuzzy texture of a peach. Immensely pleased to finally have one of these fabulous objects in his possession, he slipped it into his jacket pocket and searched around in case there were any others. Suddenly, Gribbly tapped him on the shoulder. The guards were now walking in their direction, but appeared not to have noticed them. Holding their breath, the two intruders crouched in the shadows beneath the digger and hoped they wouldn't be spotted. They heard the armed men chatting about what a brilliant job they had done and how much they were getting paid, then watched their red-uniformed legs and big heavy boots pass within a few yards. Fintan winced as he watched one of them take a casual kick at a half-squashed choco plum that was lying in his path. These hooligans didn't deserve to have their hands on these precious fruits. It wasn't right and it wasn't fair. When the danger seemed to have passed, Fintan returned his attention to searching for any remaining fruits. It looked hopeless. Even if there were any others lying around, they were out in open ground, which meant being spotted and probably being shot. Apart from the one in his pocket, every single chocoplum in the world was now either destroyed or locked up inside a massive metal container bolted beneath a Giganti Foods helicopter. It was time to go. Keeping a careful eye on the security guards, they slowly made their way back to the safety of the dark bushes. "Ah, well," sighed Fintan, disappointed but not entirely defeated. "At least we've got something to take home." Gribbly nodded in agreement, untied the end of his bit of string, and began climbing back up the muddy slope to camp. "Wait, hang on a second. I've just thought of something," said Fintan. Much to Gribbly's surprise, he crept back to the big metal fuel tank. It appeared he'd found a rather bent-looking petrol can on the ground, which by the look of it had been run over at least once. He held it up for Gribbly to see and gave a thumbs-up sign, then began filling it from the tap on the side of the petrol tank. Confused, Gribbly waited in the bushes for him to return. "Nice cup of tea," said Fintan when he got back. "We can make a fire now and have hot food and tea and everything. That will cheer us up, won't it?" Chapter 26. Having followed Gribbly's string trail all the way back to their camp, Fintan's first thought was to put the chocoplum somewhere safe. He extracted one of his many little plastic boxes from his rucksack, wrapped the precious fruit in a page torn from Young Adventurer magazine, and carefully sealed it inside. "There," he said, "all safe. Nothing left to do now but head home, I suppose." "Indeed, sir," agreed Gribbly, sounding relieved to hear the word home mentioned. "I still have the copy of the map, so may I suggest we make our way back to Anna's boat first thing tomorrow morning?" "Fine idea, Gribbs," said Fintan, "or at least first thing after breakfast. Which reminds me, let's get that fire going and have a bit of supper, eh?" The petrol can he had borrowed from Giganti Foods' international supply tank was a lot lighter than he remembered it being. On closer inspection, he noticed a jagged hole in the bottom, which was leaking its flammable contents onto the damp ground. Luckily, there was still enough left to get a campfire started, which was all they needed, after all. Fintan made a pile of logs and kindling exactly as his favourite magazine recommended, and then poured the last of the petrol over it. "Can I have the matches, please, Gribbs?" he said. Gribbly, who was selecting a few useful dried food items from the cooking pot, thought it would probably be safer if he lit the fire himself. Fintan didn't have a very good track record in the fire safety department. It wasn't just the odd barbecue, garden shed and scout hut which had gone up in flames, but now strange men's beards had to be added to the list. Perhaps I should do it, sir," he said, and made sure Fintan was standing well away and hadn't spilt petrol all over himself. As it turned out, the campfire lit beautifully and without a problem. "See," announced Fintan proudly, "I can get things right sometimes, can't I?" Gribbly conceded this point and happily began preparing another tasty stew for their supper. What both of them had failed to notice, however, was the trail of burning petrol they'd just ignited, which led from their camp and snaked off into the darkness of the forest. Just under a mile away, Max Wrench Gonzalez and his 20 other Giganti Foods employees were sitting comfortably inside their corrugated iron hut, digesting their victory meal. "I'd like to propose a toast," announced Wrench, "to a job well done. Congratulations, guys. We did it." Glasses were clinked, and a lot of self-congratulatory whooping and cheering ensued. Wrench couldn't remember ever feeling quite so happy. He had just harvested the entire crop of Brazilian chocoplums, thereby exclusively securing the world's rarest and most delicious fruit for Giganti Foods International. His boss was going to be so pleased that he was bound to give him a promotion and a raise in salary. Not only that, but his horrible, irritating wife Barbara had finally gone off and left him alone to concentrate on his true love, his career, and the pursuit of money. Better than all this, though, was the knowledge that he'd beaten that Fedora kid to the prize. He had his revenge. Feeling extremely pleased with himself, he said goodnight to his men and left the hut to make a satellite call to Buckmeister's New York office. He was just dialing the number and imagining how good it would feel to say the words "mission accomplished" to Randall, when he noticed a strange fiery snake zigzagging its way down the hill into the valley. "Hey!" he shouted to the two useless security guards who were now sitting on a log drinking coffee. "What's that?" Whatever it was, it appeared to be heading at top speed towards their fuel supply. It was moving so quickly, in fact, that before the guards had a chance to investigate, it had reached the tank and burned its way to the still dribbling tap. There was a sudden blinding flash of light as the heavy iron tank ripped itself apart and erupted in a huge orange fireball. The noise that followed a fraction of a second later was like a clap of thunder. Wrench and the inept guards were thrown flat on their backs. They lay there stunned, watching the gigantic mass of flame billowing into the night sky. A wall of hot air swept over them and singed their eyebrows. Gonzales and the rest of the men came running out of the hut and stared in amazement at the chaos. At that moment, another massive blast launched a substantial chunk of burning iron into the air, forcing the horrified men to scatter and run for cover. Then suddenly, the part of wrecked fuel tank fell to the earth like a meteor. With a terrifying deep whooshing sound, it crashed onto the cockpit of one of the helicopters, which crumpled and burst into flames. Everyone was frightened out of their wits. There was absolutely nothing they could do. The savagely roaring ball of fire quickly spread to the two nearby diggers, which instantly exploded in a mass of burning debris. "Sabotage!" shouted Wrench, running as fast as he could for the safety of the forest. "We've been sabotaged!" Confused and terrified, the men quickly abandoned the camp too. They followed Wrench into the trees, dodging lumps of flaming machinery which were falling from the sky like giant hailstones. Behind them, another helicopter blew up, taking its priceless cargo of chocoplum trees with it in a vivid plume of fire. It flipped violently into the air, landed on its back and crushing the power generator. With a shower of sparks and jagged electrical noises, the entire ring of security lights went out. A terrible red glow illuminated the jungle clearing, as one by one all their highly expensive machines succumbed to the inferno. A caterpillar-tracked digger was hurled sideways, wiping out the hut where the men had just been sitting. Tables, chairs, and the remains of their evening meal were instantly reduced to flying fragments. Wrench stared with utter disbelief at the mess. His entire chocoplum harvest was gone, as was his accommodation, his food supply, his transport, his tracking gear, and his whole professional future. It was only then that he realized he was still holding the satellite phone in his sweaty, trembling hand, and that Randall's furious voice was shrieking from it. Hurriedly, he switched the phone off. This was no time to be dealing with his boss. The last of the helicopters burst into shreds of metal, scattering itself across the blackened wasteland of what had once been the chocoplum grove. There was now nothing left at all, just a huge burning pile of wreckage. Wrench was mortified. Not 5 minutes earlier, he had been sharing a celebratory bottle of champagne with his men and feeling happier than he could ever remember. Now this was the worst possible thing that could have happened to him. A complete disaster. After waking to find Fintan's camp deserted, the Bumsteads had spent the day picking leeches off themselves and scratching. Now, less than a mile away, they were startled by a sudden thundering noise and lights in the sky. Neither of them had eaten all day and had barely moved either. Eric raised his horribly swollen and mud-caked face from the ground. "Is that fireworks?" he muttered. "How should I know?" snapped his mother, who was too busy scratching her armpit to pay any attention. Eric slumped back down again. The hunger and the fatigue and the constant terrible itching had been driving him insane. Now it seemed they were making him see things too. They didn't have firework displays in the rainforest. How crazy! He must have imagined it. The devastating destruction of Operation Harvest, which had just ruined Max Wrench's entire life, had also slightly annoyed Fintan and Gribbly. It had interrupted their supper. "Oh, good grief, what are they doing now?" complained Fintan, as a huge lurid orange plume of fire lit up the sky and booming explosions scared every bird for miles around out of the trees. "Haven't they done enough damage for one day without blowing things up as well?" He wiped up the last of his stew with a peanut butter sandwich, tutted in disapproval, and rolled his eyeballs. "Absolutely, sir," agreed Gribbly. "It would appear our business rivals have very little consideration for the natural world. I really don't approve of their methods." Fintan nodded sadly. "Nor do I, Gribbs. Bullies, that's what they are. Big, ignorant bullies." They sat drinking their mugs of steaming tea and disapprovingly watched the continuing fire show illuminate the darkness and disrupt the peace of the forest. "Well, better get some kip then," said Fintan, and started packing their dinner things away. By the time he'd finished hoisting the cooking pot stuffed with their remaining food supply up a tree, the nearby firestorm seemed to have burned itself out. "Well, I just hope they're proud of themselves, that's all I can say," he said, as he climbed into his hammock. "Indeed. Good night, Master Fintan, sir," added Gribbly, who was already zipped into his sleeping bag and busy flicking the insects out of his mosquito net. "Sleep well. We've got an early start in the morning." And I'll see you tomorrow for another couple of chapters.